Hello, Manu here. Let's make this geometry nodes grass, ball or planet. We are using Blender 2.93 for making this. So let's delete the default cube and make a icosphere object. The default settings are fine. Then let's make a nice lighting for the scene. Let's use sun lamp, but the intensity only to 5. Let's add more lights later. Then select the camera and reset its rotation with Alt R and location with Alt G. And move it a little bit with Y axis and rotate it by 90 degrees to point straight at the ball. I like to use this kind of layout for making this thing. Then copy the vertical resolution to horizontal as well to make it a square image, and dolly the camera a bit to make it closer to the ball. And in edit mode, let's subdivide this 3 times and make the smoothness to 1. Then right click and shade smooth. Then let's add brown material for the ball. You can copy the brown color with Ctrl+C by hovering over the color slot, and you can paste it to the viewport display color as well with Ctrl+V. Then let's make a couple of rim lights by duplicating the sunlight and putting it as point. I'm using tilde key, the key next to 1, to have the camera pie menu open. I put radius of 15 meters for the point lamp and power to something like 10,000 watts, and make it a little bit more yellowish on the color side, as well as the sun lamp also, just a tiny bit. Then let's duplicate the rim light to make another rim light and position it like so. Put something like 2000 watts for its power and radius to 3 meters. All of this is just to make a nice looking planet for the whole tutorial. Then make the world lighting a little bit more white. I also like to make a blue gradient for the camera view. That happens by going to the shader editor and selecting world from the drop down menu. Duplicate the background node, and I accidentally put it to volume, but I fix it later. Then enable the node wrangler add-on from the settings and select one of the background nodes and press Ctrl+T to make these extra nodes. Select the environment texture node and press Shift+S and switch it to gradient texture node. And then make a color ramp node with Shift+A and search. Add just the gradient a little bit and put the quadratic sphere for the gradient texture and the vector to window. This is a good time to actually switch from volume to the surface shader, which actually makes things visible. Then I usually fiddle with the values until it looks alright. I never figure out the values by knowing. It's always a matter of tweaking and tweaking. Then I put a nice blue for the gradient color ramp, just to make it a nice sky texture. Something like that looks nice. Then I like to put passepartout for the camera view, so that we can see only what's inside the camera. Just select the camera, go to viewport display and put the passepartout to 1. And adjust the gradient to be at the center of the camera view. Then let's add a light path node to make this blue affect only the background, not the planet itself. So make a mix shader and connect the light path camera ray node to factor. In here I demonstrate how the light affects either the planet or the background, but not both. Then remember to save your file and let's make the grass blade object. So just make a simple plane, rotate it by 90 degrees, scale it down, and then in edit mode extrude the upper edge with Ctrl and right clicking. Make the up and bottom to have close edges so that it looks nice when we add solidify and subsurf modifier. Then let's add material for the grass. Some nice green will do, even though I later decide to add a gradient for the grass blade also, which happens by going to edit mode and selecting all polygons and pressing U and unwrap. And in the UV editor it's good to adjust the UV a little bit. With Alt you can select the edge loops in UV editor. I just scale all the edge loops or edges to be horizontal by pressing S and then Y. Then in the object shader editor I select the principal shader and press Ctrl T to make the extra nodes, and once again press Shift S to convert the environment texture to gradient texture, and then make the color ramp. It's hard to find the good settings for the mapping node, but use these values and you should be okay. After that I can paint the whole grass blade from bottom to top with different colors. In the gradient color ramp node I can flip the ramp so that white is at the top. Then after a lot of adjustments I end up with these kind of values. And that's it for the material of the grass blade. Then I realized it's wise to reset the scale and rotation for the object, which happens by Ctrl A. And as you can see, the solidify modifier needs to be adjusted again. Now the grass blade is ready for spreading all over the globe. Then I want to make a variation of the grass blade so that all of them don't look the same. Feel free to make even more of these variations and then add them to a new collection called grass blades. That happens with the shortcut key M. It's good to name all the objects so that you know what's happening in the scene. While we are at it, let's rename all the lights as well and the planet. Save the scene, and now we are finally ready to jump to the geometry nodes. I like to adjust the layout like this. Use N to hide the tool panel from the right. Then select the planet and click New in the Geometry Nodes view to make a Geometry Nodes modifier. The first connection in Geometry Nodes is the planet itself. We will add the grass blades over the line and join it in the Join Geometry node. Let's add Point Distribute node in order to make these points on top of the planet. From density you can add more of those points. Then let's add Point Instance node in order to replace the points with the grass blades, and select the grass collection to the Point Instance node, and remember to set the option to collection, and also uncheck the whole collection because otherwise it instances the whole collection. Apparently the center or the origin of the scene is the center point of the collection, of the whole collection, that is. Then let's scale the grass blades down with Point Scale node, like so. It makes sense to use the Poisson disk distribution method for the Point Distribute node. That means that the objects don't overlap each other, at least too much. Then I wanted to add just the colors of the grass blade material once again. It seems way too white. Then I adjusted the lights to be a bit more brighter. Alright, let's add some wind to affect the grass blades. But first let's add the density to the group input so that we can access it from the modifiers tab. Then shift right click somewhere outside the planet and add an empty object. A cube, for example. This will drive the passing wind eventually. With M, add it to a new collection called empties. Rename the object as empty wind. Make some room for the timeline and add the first keyframe with I. Add second keyframe to frame 100 so that the empty has passed the planet, like so. Then select all the keyframes with A and press Shift E to make the extrapolation as cyclic. Now the empty keeps repeating its motion through the whole timeline. Then let's add vertex weight proximity modifier for the planet. It needs to be on top of the Geometry Nodes modifier in order to have an effect. Then let's make a new vertex group called VG Wind, and let's add that to the vertex weight proximity modifier, as well as the empty wind object. And then use these settings. Then go to the weight paint mode with Ctrl Tab, and I like to put the viewport shading as object color instead of material, just to make it more clear to see the effect of the weights. I pressed the dot icon in the up left corner to have all the vertices shown, and then I pressed Shift K to put all the weights to 1 for all the vertices. Now when you scrub the timeline, you should see how the so-called wind goes past the planet. Now we can use the vertex group to drive the motion of the grass blades. Let's go back to the object mode, select the planet and select geometry nodes, and we need to go to the modifier tab to select the geometry nodes we have made. So let's add attribute color ramp node, and by control clicking you can add some markers to the ramp. Make it look like something like this, or you can play around and see how it affects the wind. I think the black values are zeros and white values are ones, so it oscillates from ones to zeros and back when the wind empty passes by the planet. Use these settings for the attribute and result. We just made up the rotation wind value or attribute. You don't need to use the list to find those. Then let's add point rotate node, and so we can use our rotation wind attribute to drive the rotation of the grass blades. Now when you put more instances to the globe and press play, it should look like this. It seemed that the empty went a little bit too far, so that there is still phases in the wind loop, and the wind was too quick, so I moved keyframe to 200 or 300 even, and then I checked at which point the movement stops and made a keyframe there and removed the most last keyframe. I hope this makes sense. The point was to have the empty to be more closer to the planet at all times. Then in the attribute color ramp I put another white marker to be gray, so that the grass blades don't rotate that much at that time. After that it looked quite good, all in all. But I still decided to add some randomizing for the rotation of each grass blade. So add a attribute randomize node, use the rotation wind as the attribute and put it to vector and add. I put a little smaller values to the max, and then I decided to even animate all of the values by hovering over the values and pressing I. Then I pressed Shift F6 to go into the graph editor and selected one of the values and added a not cycles but noise modifier to it, and then adjusted the values so that it looked nice. This involved a lot of experimentation, so try to find good settings that look nice. You can copy and paste the noise modifier from one value to another from those icons in the up corner. So just experiment away to find good settings. Then I added keyframes also to the max values and pasted the noise modifier to those keyframes also. I used different phase for each noise modifier so that they don't look like the same, which means behaving the same, so that there is really some randomizing going on. Then was time to randomize some of the scaling as well. So I added another attribute randomize node and vector and add and used actually replace create and used the scale attribute for that, and then adjusted the minimum and maximum so that it once again looked nice, or like grass. And then I wanted to randomize a little bit of the color of the grass blades, which happens with the object info node and adding a color ramp, but this happens in the shader editor, not in the geometry nodes editor, just to be sure. The random thing from the object info randomizes the color to be something from the whole color ramp. So now it takes, well, you can see it in the viewport. So each of the grass blades have a different color, and then I mix it so that it's only a slight variation of color for each grass blade. Then I also make a copy of the color ramp and reset it and make it black and white so that there is some very white grass blades popping out from all of the grass. And then I added a little more green to the mix with a third mix node. This looks way better in cycles in comparison to Eevee rendering engine. I used cycles for the final render, but Eevee was good for previewing the process of making this. Then I added some more green to the black and white color ramp as well. I could cut out this part, but there might be some of you who want to see all of this. Anyway, hard to say. Well, this is a tutorial for beginners, so it's good to show all of the steps. But okay, I finally settled to this color. The change is not much, but it's always a nice subtle color variation, which is nice. Here I tried cycles rendering and it looks so much nicer, especially if you add some subsurface scattering for the shader. And here I add some denoising for the rendering, cycles rendering. Yeah, so much nicer. But yeah, maybe next time I will have some good material values ready at hand, so that you don't need to watch me tweaking these forever. But it's nice YouTube has these sections in the timeline, so you can skip ahead to the most important parts. Okay, then I decided to make the hole from where the growing of the grass will begin. Then I used Shift S to snap the cursor to the bottommost vertex and added a empty there, which I named empty starting point. Then I went to weight paint mode, enabled the vertices and pressed A to select all of the vertices. But then I needed to add a new vertex group by going here and named it VG starting point and assigned all of the vertices to that. Then for the growing we need a new vertex weight proximity modifier, and we need to put it above the geometry nodes modifier again and select the starting point, vertex group and empty, and put these settings for them. And so we can animate this highest value in order to make the grass grow from one point. So just make a new keyframe for it, like so, and then maybe in 150 make it fully red, like so, and insert another keyframe. Now we can see in the timeline how the growing effect happens. Okay, back in geometry nodes, let's add another attribute color amp node between the two you can see here, and name the attribute as VG starting point and result as scale. But this didn't work just yet. I later realized that the node after this node replaces all the scale that is happening, so the growing doesn't happen. The replace needed to be changed to multiply, and now it worked like it should. I needed to adjust the values a little bit so that the grass looked nicer, but now it worked. Perhaps a little bit too fast. So I pressed Shift F6 again, and in the graph editor I pressed T to change the first keyframe to exponential. That helped a little bit. Then I made more time between the keyframes, and that was actually a little bit too much, so some adjusting was necessary. Then it was time to add some mushrooms, but first I wanted to adjust the scale of the grass to be a little bit smaller. It could be done with the attribute color ramp, but we can also make a group input for that, so that we can adjust the size of the grass blades from the modifier. But actually I will make it later. Now I imported or appended the mushrooms from the production files and organized the outliner a little bit. Then it was handy to make a frame for the nodes so that it clearly states where the grass blades are made and where the mushrooms are made, for example. In my mind, you should be able to make even brighter frame nodes than this, but this is okay. And then for the mushrooms, just select all and duplicate and name it as shrooms. And connect the geometry inputs and outputs. And select the mushrooms collection to the point instance node. Now the mushrooms are there, but really small. They need to be scaled up. It partly helps to increase the brightness of the attribute color ramp white, but we want to scale them more than that maybe. So maybe now is the time to make a scale group input, or maybe not. Let's see. Yes, at least for the density. And after you have made these, it makes sense to rename those density max fields with something more accurate, like grass amount and shrooms amount. At this point I wanted to add a group input for the wind effect, so that the shrooms don't get affected that much from the wind as the grass blades. So add the attribute math node, put it to multiply, put the B to float, and A will be rotation wind attribute, and result will be also the rotation wind. And then just drag the B float to the group input and rename it as shrooms wind effect. So at first, because it's 0 now, the shrooms don't get any effect from the wind. I will test this later. Now it's time to make the scale group input. So make a new attribute math node after the attribute randomize node for scale, and for the math attribute math node put it to multiply and B to float, and A will be scale and result will be scale as well, and then just drag the B again to the group input node and rename it like it should be shrooms scale. And let's do the same for the grass as well now that we are at it. So multiply, float, scale, and dragging to the group input. And this will be the grass scale. You can organize the group inputs from the arrows. Okay, now it's nice and tidy. And now we can easily adjust the amounts and scales from the modifier. Like so. Looking quite nice actually. Now the shrooms seems like they stop in the wind because they don't have the randomized rotation animated. The keyframes were lost when we duplicated the grass nodes. So we might need to add those noise modifiers for the keyframes again. Just insert the keyframes and in graph editor add those noise modifiers. Now the shrooms look a little bit more organic in their movement. Maybe too much actually. So I disable some of the keyframes. Okay, time to add the road. Enable the curve extras in add-ons and you can find the curve spirals in here after that, and add the Archimedean type spiral, and then we need to rotate it a little bit so that we can see what's going on. Let's add 90 to some of these view fields like so, and then we need to add the radius and a lot of those turns. Now we get a nice spiral curve. Rotate it so that the end point is at the bottom and put it to Bezier and Auto so it's very smooth. Then move it away from the view and let's make a perfect circle around the globe. Rotate it 90 degrees in x-axis. Then let's isolate the view from the numpad slash and let's put the spiral exactly 2 meters above and to the 0 of x-axis so that it's straight on top of the circle shape. Select all the points with A and press V to put them as free tangents or handles. And now we need to delete the segment that is on the top right. First subdivide it and then select these 2 points and or actually these 2 points and delete the little segment. Then join the curves. Select all the points and put them to free handles. Select last point of the spiral and delete it, and then select these 2 points and press F to fill them. Now we have a nice road curve available. Let's smooth out the curve by going to curve settings and putting the resolution to 64. It smooths out the curve quite a lot. Then make a empty, a cube one, and put the Bezier circle inside it. Select the curve, then select with shift the empty and press Ctrl P to parent the circle inside the empty. Then go away from the local view from the numbered slash and put them inside the empties collection. Rename the empty as empty road and the circle as Bezier circle road. Then it's time to make the road itself. Let's make a plane and scale it down to 0.2 and 0.15 in X and Y axes and apply the scale with Ctrl A. Select the two edges and right click and subdivide and put 12 subdivisions. Now we have a good base for the road. Now it's good time to unwrap the geometry. So press U and unwrap, and in the UV editor you can see that it doesn't fill the whole square. So let's go to the top viewport and select U and project from U bounds. Now it fills the whole viewport. Then rotate it 90 degrees, so like so. Then duplicate the empty road and rename it as empty road unroll. And move the circle inside the unroll and the unroll inside the empty road. You can adjust the scale of the size of the empty from the settings, but make sure not to scale it. Then let's add array modifier for the road or the plane, and let's make a quick material for it. Then let's add curve modifier for it and select the Bezier circle road as the curve object and press Alt G to clear the location of the road. Select the road and move it on X axis to have it follow the curve nicely, and add something like 44 sections in the array modifier. This seems to work quite nicely, but eventually we need only the road to be one turn around the circle, so 16 pieces of array modifier is good. Make a keyframe to the road in frame 200 and make another keyframe for it in the frame 100, so that it wraps around the planet like so. Select all the keyframes from the timeline and press V and select vector as the keyframe handle type. We need to parent the road also to the empty road unroll. Like so. Now it sticks to the control nicely. At frame 100 make a keyframe for the empty road unroll and go to the frame 200 and turn the empty around 360 degrees and make a keyframe there. Select all the keyframes and press V and put them to be also vector. Shade the road smooth. I think it's already quite enough, but I really wanted the road to stay in place or not move when I play the timeline, so I find the empty road unroll keyframe at the end and try to put a nice value for it. Eventually I used 363.5, which made it stay in place. Then I renamed the empty road as empty road placement and the empty road unroll as empty road unroll animation, to make it clear that the placement is how I position the whole thing around the circle so that it won't be visible in the beginning like so. Now it looks quite nice. Let's add solidify modifier for the road, and in the array check merge, and the thickness can be something like 0.034 or something. I put also auto smooth for the mesh settings. This looked quite nice. Then I guess it's time to make the road lines with shaders. But actually first let's add some camera animation to rotate around the empty. So let's make a new empty once again and name it as empty camera rotation and parent the camera onto it, and simply make 2 keyframes for the empty camera rotation object and select all the keyframes and put them press Shift E and put them as linear extrapolation. Now the camera moves outside the keyframes as well. I ended up selecting the keyframes and scaling about -1 so that the road is not visible in the beginning. Okay, time to make the grass and shrooms to yield when the road comes on top of them. So put the geometry nodes off and let's make a new modifier for the planet, a vertex weight proximity modifier, that is, once again. But before that, let's make a new vertex group called VG Road. And let's not forget to go into the weight paint mode and assign values 1 for each vertex, for all the vertices. And now let's add the vertex weight proximity modifier, and vertex group is the VG Road, and target object is okay. At least it seems I am renaming these just to make it more clear what is happening. But after that, put the VG road and target object as road geo. And proximity mode as geometry, select the face and then adjust the values. It seemed that maybe because I had EV on, the road did not the weight did not seem to stick to the surface of the ball, but now my Blender crashed, and when I opened it again, everything seems to work. So maybe you need to reopen the scene in order to make it work. It was a little bit weird. Okay, so let's go back to the geometry nodes and copy. No, because this is road, so we need a new node called attribute mix with subtract and factor to 1 and A as VC. I was thinking why I don't get the list, but geometry nodes need to be enabled in the viewport so that we get the list. But put the attributes like so, and then the grass goes away when the road goes along. And then just copy the node to shrooms also, and the effect is there. Quite nice. Okay, now it's time to make the road texture. Select the road and once again make gradient texture with the Ctrl-T nodes. Then add color ramp and adjust the color ramp. Well, at first put it to constant and then adjust the sliders or markers so that we get those lines, white lines for the road. After that, copy the whole thing and let's make the line that goes in the middle of the road. Then copy them again and let's put 90 degrees to the Z value, minus 90 that is. And then make some kind of black line that will be the cut for the straight line, and then use multiply with full value for the two nodes and adjust it as you see best, and then add another or copy the multiply node to make to combine and make it as add to combine the lines together. And so finally we have the road texture there. We can also add a bump node easily for this. But it has not a lot of effect for the final result. but the texture is still on the back side of the road as well. But that's easily fixed. We just need to make a new material called road backside, and in the solidify modifiers settings we can put in the materials menu or drop down menu we can put 1 to the material offset, and now it's fixed. Okay, let's make some buildings. This time we go to the vertex paint mode to paint some areas where the buildings will appear. So let's make a new vertex color channel VC buildings placement. Then go to vertex paint mode and put all the vertices as black. This will be the area where there is no, with Shift K. This is the area where will be no buildings, and with white paint some areas where there will be buildings. And a little speed up, and I appended the buildings from the production files. Then let's go to geometry nodes once again and copy shrooms and change the frame node as buildings, and of course connect the geometry sockets. And then we need only one attribute separation node before the point distribute, and vector is VC buildings placement, and we need only one result from this. Let's put it to X and call it result buildings, or just simply buildings. And then we need attribute math node just before the point instance node. And it will be multiply for the scale, and B attribute is buildings. And so far we cannot see anything because we need to enable buildings collection, and it's at 0 in the scale attribute math node, so we need to put it to the group input so that we can control the buildings scale. Like so. I had disabled some nodes, so at first the whole planet was full of buildings, but now that I enable all the nodes, everything seems to behave perfectly. Nice. Then I just adjusted the modifier settings so that grass was small and with a lot of density, and you might need to adjust the grass point distributes Poisson disk distance to make the grass more thick. Then I made a new empty that would act as the depth of field empty or target for depth of field. I renamed it as empty DOF, and then I selected camera and put the empty DOF as the DOF object. Here I needed to change the Poisson disk distance to a little bit smaller to have a very thick grass. And then I just moved the sunlight a little bit towards the camera so that more stuff was on receiving light. And that was it. Then it was ready to send for rendering. I used the free Sheepit render farm service, which is very nice. It didn't took like it took like 4 hours for rendering the whole sequence. But I must admit I have something like 60 million points in there, so I get first in line. But that's why you should leave your computer to render other people's frames overnight to gather those points. So here we see how the final result looks like. Quite nice. And here's a render I made earlier and used a little bit more time on. Basically the same thing but with more objects and stuff, cars and tiles and everything. Oh, and we just released a course with Creative Shrimp that if you want to check it out, here's one of the trailers. Yes, nice stuff. Okay, so that was it for this tutorial. See you next time. Bye.